So right now we're here to talk about the economics of news, and it's my personal view that this is my Oxford college was the third oldest of the 30-odd colleges in Oxford, and the sign outside the door said it has a good claim to be Oxford's oldest college, which sort of artfully stopped just short of asserting the claim. And I think that's what I want to do here. I want to say that economics has a good claim to be the most important aspect of what we're here to talk about today, because ultimately it constrains and determines and enables so much of what we do in any market-driven society. So we have three ideal people with us to discuss it. We have Gordon Crovitz, who is the recently retired publisher and newly empaneled columnist on technology and the digital world at the Wall Street Journal, but who has had a wide-ranging series of interesting roles related to the digital pursuits and businesses of the Journal and of Dow Jones. We have with us Mark Davis from the San Diego Union-Tribune, where he serves as Vice President for Strategy, which is no doubt a fascinating and action-packed role these particular days. And we have Eric Alterman, whose roles in academia and in the press are wide and varied, and who recently wrote a well-received New Yorker essay on the death or putative death of print, which I think has served as a fulcrum for many of the conversations that have occurred on this issue in recent weeks. So I'm thrilled to have all three of them here, and I'll say no more and turn it over to Gordon.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, David. When David told me that the title of this panel was Economics of News, I wondered whether it was a yes-no question. And you know, here we are 10 years after the beginning of the digital revolution affecting the news media, and this is unfortunately a very timely issue. You would think the people in the news media, news executives, my peers, you would think that in a business driven by deadlines, people would have asked this question maybe a decade ago. So here we are at Princeton. We're going to solve the problem this afternoon, which will be great. Here's how serious the problem was. The first time I took my older son to the beach, he was about 18 months old, and I had just come from some off-site, and he went to the beach, he walked down to the beach, 18 months old, looked at the waves, and it was clear that he did not like the waves. So he reached down, he picked up some sand and threw sand into the waves. The waves didn't stop. He, other arm, threw more sand into the waves. And he did this for about 20 minutes. Any of you who have toddlers know that 20 minutes is basically forever. So he reminded me very much of many of the executives in the media industry, hoping that these waves of change could be reversed by tossing sand or something. So I want to start at a very high level, and then we'll look forward to your questions. But it seems to me that there are really three different factors affecting the economics of news, basically none of them in a good direction. So the first one is the technology is changing consumer behavior, and I'll talk a bit more about that. The second is that there are all these new business models that are driven by these new technologies that have challenged traditional business models without solving some of the problems of the traditional model, like the high fixed costs of actually having news people to create the journalism or what we increasingly refer to as the content. And the third is that these new technologies that are changing consumer behavior and changing business models, these technologies are moving at a rapid but unpredictable pace. And this is affecting an industry, the news media industry, that largely had similar business models for 3 or 4 generations of news executives. So you marry aggressive technological change with entrenched, comfortable, mature industries, and the result is not good. Some of you might know this great Silicon Valley observation, the first law of technology. It says that whenever there's a new technology that affects consumer behavior, we always tend to overestimate the impact of that change in the short term, but then underestimate the impact of that change in the long term. So those of you old enough to remember Web 1.0 in its early years, right, the sock puppet, we were all going to buy our household pets online. So a lot of business models in that era turned out to be not such good ideas. A lot of traditional executives in media looked at the bursting of the dot-com bubble and said, "Phew, glad we avoided that, turned out not to be such a big deal." Now, of course, despite some of those business models failing, usage of digital technologies by consumers has only increased throughout that time period. And the great risk for traditional news companies, traditional media now, is that people continue to underestimate how big an impact these changes are going to have. I'd like to cite another era that was actually rather similar to our own, where technology really changed things and people thought it was going to change things right away, and it turned out in that case that it took a little while, but it did change things enormously. So think back 150 years ago, technologists lay the undersea cable. The telegraph era had just gotten underway. Queen Victoria sends a message to President Buchanan, real-time transatlantic communication. This literally rocked the world. There was rioting in New York City. They almost burnt down City Hall. The London Times had an editorial that said that this had, in effect, reversed the revolution of 1776, and the States and the UK were reunited. Tiffany's, the jewelry company, sold little bits, unused bits of the cable as jewelry. The best-selling novel that year was called Wired Love, which was about Morse code operators who met online and I guess then met as carbon-based life forms. So, you know, the UK and the US did not reunite overnight. Things did not change right away, but the news business, for one, did change. James Rothschild, who was the head of the Rothschild banking family, was really annoyed by the telegraph and the transatlantic cable. His business model had been private messengers going from European trading city to European trading city with inside information, not necessarily illegal, just things the family knew that others did not know. And these messengers would go to his cousins in different European cities. They trade on the information. And he complained that now anyone can get the news and that it was a crying shame that the telegraph had been established. So fast forward to that era, newspapers suddenly were in a funny position. Basic information was readily available. As we heard earlier today, the Associated Press was created as a way to address the cost issue of information being widely available. Kind of combining the trends of information being widely available and people's expectations growing, when the Wall Street Journal was created in 1889, it had what was then a radical mission. It was to try to get information about markets to individuals with the same standard of journalism that professionals were used to. So there's an ad for the Wall Street Journal from 1899 that says, "Are you one of the 180,000 shareholders in the newly industrialized companies?" Entire target audience for the Wall Street Journal at its founding were the 200,000 or so people who own stock on the New York Exchange, the Philadelphia Exchange, the Boston Exchange. It gives you a sense of what the telegraph era did to change people's expectations and to change the news business. So let me spend a couple of minutes now about talking to you about newspapers and why most of them are in such trouble. Let's say 20 years ago you lived in Chicago and you were interested in international news and national news and business news and what was going on with the Cubs and what was being offered at the school cafeteria, you had some choices. You could read the Chicago Tribune or the Chicago Sun-Times, or if it was still around, the Chicago Daily News, and they were all great bundles of news focusing on what happened the day before, all sorts of different domains of interest, using the then best technology, which was print delivered to your driveway or to your desk once a day. If you now live in Chicago and you're interested in those topics, you can get probably better sources of information about every one of those topics more quickly, usually the day of, and this accounts, I think, significantly for the decline of the big metro newspapers. I like to say if I were half my age, I'm not sure I would have gotten in the habit of reading my local newspaper either. And actuarially, I'm exactly twice half my age. And there are definitely days that go by when I don't read my local newspaper in New York, whose name will go unmentioned, because it continues to focus on what happened the day before. You know, a lot of us know what happened the day before from our BlackBerries or from websites or RSS feeds or from whatever source, and yet American journalism in the newspaper format, the print newspaper format, is really still stuck on what editors grew up with, which was what happened the day before. Enormous circulation declines, 30, 40%. Worse, actually, if you dig a little bit to see what the quality of the circulation is. And if any of you are interested, the ABC statements are public. You can actually look to see the number of individually paid copies to your local newspaper, and I guarantee you it is depressing reading. It is, however, not as depressing as what's happening on the advertising side. So we heard from Dan earlier, what is really harming the news business is the model that said we're not really going to charge people very much to get access to the news. We're going to make it up on the advertising side. So I used to joke a decade ago, what idiots we newspaper and magazine publishers were. You could buy a newspaper for the same price as a cup of coffee. There's no newspaper now that charges half as much as the smallest latte at Starbucks. Websites are almost all free, as you know. The Wall Street Journal is a rare exception to that rule, driven in part by the fact that the content is very differentiated and people see a way to make some money from it. But there are now more people subscribing and paying for the online edition of the Wall Street Journal than there are people who pay to get the print New York Times. So people will pay if asked and if the quality of the content is good enough. But the circulation side has not supported serious journalism in most media, certainly including newspapers, for about 50 years. The advertising is the big problem. There was a retailer in Philadelphia named John Wanamaker 100 years ago who said, I know that half of my advertising is wasted, I just don't know which half. Targetable media like online, to some degree cable television, has made non-targetable media like newspapers and magazines very uneconomic. In other words, advertisers who used to not know which 50 cents of their dollar was wasted now can get for about 20 cents what they used to pay $1 to get. That has not favored mass media like newspapers and like magazines. So these are very serious problems, and they are married with the fact that technology now dictates consumer choice and consumer behavior in a way that is very new for the traditional news media. Silicon Valley is having more of an impact on news consumption than the journalism schools or even Madison Avenue, the advertising part of the business. And most news media companies are completely unprepared to think about new forms of distribution, especially electronic ones, having grown up in a very analog world of newspaper publishing, of delivering newspapers or news in just one way through the print format. So those are all the reasons to be concerned. On the economic side, circulation revenues do not cover much in the way of news costs. They cover a lower and lower percentage as newspapers in all formats, print, online, and others, charge either nothing or not very much. Same with most magazines. That is not necessarily a permanent state of affairs. I think at the earlier panel someone mentioned the magazine The Week, which is a weekly aggregation of news done with real style and intelligence applied to the news. That has almost no advertising from what I can gather, covered entirely from circulation revenue in the print format. Likewise, The Economist magazine has been growing significantly. It charges a serious amount for a subscription. You don't get a clock radio, you don't get a beach ball, you don't get a lot of things that other magazines are offering. They're communicating to their potential readers there is value here. We expect to get a reasonable payment for it. I am, however, at the end of the day, something of an optimist that this industry, which has been so slow to address the challenges, will figure out ways to cover the costs of journalism. On the advertising side, we are in about the second or third inning of marketers finding the most efficient ways to reach audiences. It does turn out, I think, and research, I think, will show that this is true, that people's engagement with traditional media, whether in print or online, traditional brands, is at a different level than their engagement with other unbranded media, and yet marketers are not yet able to distinguish it. The advertising revenues that traditional publishers get will continue to increase. The CPMs, the amount that people get for web pages will increase. For many newspapers, the online advertising revenue is pennies on the dollar, maybe a quarter on the dollar from what it had been in print, but those pennies or that quarter will add up over the years and begin to cover more of the costs of the news departments. We're not yet at a low point in terms of print advertising, I don't think, but we are far from a high point in terms of online and other digital forms of revenue. At the end of the day, I'm optimistic mostly because traditional news companies really do not have any choice but to figure this out. This is their business. There will be a lot of experimentation. I think you'll hear about some of that this afternoon. But at the end of the day, the business model for traditional news publishers starts with that high fixed cost of the journalists who create the journalism that creates the brand, that creates a certain expectation, which is different than unbranded forms of media. That is where the value is. And so news publishers, one way or the other, will have to figure this out, and I hope that we'll have the chance to talk about some of those solutions as part of the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Gordon.
So, Gordon, I'm looking for my sand. As a representative, someone who actually works at a local newspaper or a media company, as we like to call ourselves these days, I feel a bit like the engine room snipe who was just called to the bridge of the ship by the captain who wants to know how the turbines are running. So hopefully we'll get our hands a little bit dirty with some of the statistics that Gordon referred to. We have at the San Diego Union-Tribune, once a quarter, we have a managers meeting, supervisors and above, and it's a couple hundred people, and the last several have gone this way. The CEO gets up and says, times are tough, we have to buckle down, but we can do it. Then the CFO gets up and she says, times are really tough and you can't buy as many pencils. And at that point everybody is pretty much suicidal, and that's when I get the floor to try to convince everyone that we have a plan and it's going to work. So I'll try to do a little bit of that here in a brief time. But let me start by setting the context with some of these figures. So you understand really where newspapers have come from and kind of this hole we have to dig ourselves out of. So some statistics. And first, daily readership. And when I talk about daily readership, I'm talking about a survey that asked people in the last 5 days, 5 weekdays, have you looked at a newspaper? And this is a pretty generous measure, right? This isn't do you subscribe, you know, how long did you read it? This is have you seen it? So in 1964, 81% of adults looked at a daily newspaper. In 2007, it was 48%. If we look at daily circulation, and these are actual copies sold, whether it's by subscription or on the newsstand, in 1964, that circulation was 60 million. This is daily now, not Sunday. And in 2006, it was 52 million. So, geez, even if you're an optimist, you might say, oh, that's only 8 million. But need I remind you that population in 1964 was 192 million. Now it's just about 300 million. And then print advertising. Print advertising really peaked in 2000. And total advertising was about $49 billion. Of that, just about $20 billion was classifieds. And since then, by 2007, advertising has gone down, total advertising by 13%, and classified has dropped by 27.5%. So that's pretty precipitous, Now, let me talk about, and Gordon referred to this as well, this is the dollars for pennies problem, which is also known as mice in the front door, elephants out the back. And this is, if you look, and this is, I think, generally true for the industry. It's certainly pretty much true for in San Diego. If you look at our monthly uniques, unique visitors to our website, they're about 10 times our daily subscription. But if you look at our online revenue, it's about 10% of our print revenue. So it's exactly the opposite of what you'd really like it to be. Online revenue makes up, and again, this is for the industry, about 7 to 9% of total revenue. And it had been growing pretty nicely, but recently that growth has decelerated, and in many cases it's actually stopped. And it's really kind of the result of an originally brilliant, and I say that ironically, move by the industry, which was to tie the growth part of our business online with that shrinking part or print through upsells. So the industry went out, it was used to selling to large advertisers, those advertisers that could afford to actually advertise in the newspaper, and upsold them to online. And what we did then is disregarded pure play, online advertising sales. So as a result, now that we actually had a product and have a product that the smaller advertiser could buy, the smaller local advertiser, we just are so completely unfamiliar with how to sell to that advertiser. And we're missing it, right? These upsells have really hurt. And largely as a consequence, we're losing local online market share for advertising. 2 years ago, newspapers had about 44% of that market share. Now it's down to about 35%. And again, it's companies like Google who have made buying online advertising so easy. I mean, heck, it's self-served. You know exactly what you're getting. You buy it, you can see it, run through. And that's where the small guys are going. I mean, they don't want to talk to a sales rep. We were having a meeting the other day, and folks were lamenting the fact that at one point our call center got, and I forget the exact number, about 1,500 calls a week. And now we get 300 calls. And, you know, there was sort of that newspaper sigh around the table, the good old days. And I said, well, the goal is 0, right? And, you know, there was this puzzled look. And I said, no, it's 0, because what we really want is we want these folks not to have to talk to someone, but to just go online and do it self-service. That's how we start to bring back these small local advertisers. And then perversely, newspapers actually have a page view problem, which translates into an inventory problem. We actually can sell more ads than we have inventory for, but we need to build up the page views. I wish they were the small advertiser, though. Typically, in recessions, which were, depending on what you believe, headed into in the throes of, newspaper advertising has bounced back pretty strongly in about 3 years. That was at least up until the 2001 recession, when it really didn't. There was a little blip, but it really didn't bounce back. And obviously the question is, will it ever bounce back? And I think the smart money suggests we're in this secular downtrend, not just a cyclical one, And unless we change some things, it's just not going to come back. And finally, in this regard, I want to try to put to rest this notion of addicted to margins. We've heard a lot about how big and healthy margins were for newspaper companies in the 1990s. Certainly that's true. And then as things started to shift away from print, newspapers saw that they needed to make some technological investments, and they didn't want to lose those margins. As a result, they started to cut, and in many cases started to cut muscle. Oftentimes those were journalists from the newsroom. And the newspapers rightly came in for a lot of criticism. But now, and I really believe, through this recession, through 2008, the question is no longer can our margin be 22% or can it be 26%. The question really is, will our margins be positive or negative? And you see that in the news now. This really is not any longer this question of, gee, you just want to keep the money in the company. We're really struggling to get positive margins, and will as this year goes on. So now let me real quickly talk about, sort of be the glass is half full guy, and talk about 5 focus areas, strategic focus areas that I think the industry needs to focus on. The revenue, organization, relevance, community, and distribution. Those are key areas for us in San Diego and throughout the business. Let me just give some quick examples of each one. When it comes to revenue, I think probably the most prominent initiative there are ad networks, online ad networks. You see that some of the major newspaper companies have formed Quadrant 1 to create an ad network. Google actually has a bit of a network going in terms of print advertising. But I think the most prominent network in the news these days is the Yahoo Newspaper Consortium. And this consortium, which I forget how many participants it has, it's in the several hundreds in terms of newspapers, but it's really a cross-selling and an ad platform partnership. There is some content involved, largely through links to content. There's also some search involved, again, web search, not site search, and search advertising and context advertising. But it's really this cross-selling that allows newspapers to sell into Yahoo's local ad inventory. And in general, or on general, that probably increases the ad inventory newspapers have to sell by about 3 times, just about triples it. Yahoo is also able then to sell into newspapers' ad inventory. There's not a whole lot of that going on right now, but that's coming down the pike as well. And just as importantly, I think, is the Yahoo ad server, or their ad platform, which is called AMP. And you may have seen some press releases about that recently. But this ad server, which partners will be able to use, handles rich media and all those good kind of new ads coming out. But it also does a great job with geo-targeting and behavioral targeting. And this thing hasn't actually launched, so we don't quite know exactly if it will live up to its promise. But I haven't seen it, but everything I've heard, admittedly mostly from Yahoo folks, suggests that it's pretty good. And this behavioral targeting idea with Yahoo is critical because although there are other ad servers that will do this, there are other networks that will do it, Yahoo has this incredibly full and rich data set behind it so that as a visitor comes to Sign On San Diego website, for example, there's this whole data trail that follows that visitor because they've been through all sorts of Yahoo sites, as well as other sites where there may be Yahoo advertising and can cookie them. So if you don't have a lot of information, you can't sell a lot of behaviorally targeted ads. But with this Yahoo data set comes the ability to really start to monetize this. And these ads, behaviorally targeted ads, you'll be able to sell at a premium compared to just plain old banners or other types. So let me try to move through. So self-serve will also become important for newspapers on the revenue side, as will analytics, and also capturing more of the marketing spend. 20 years ago, advertising made up about 70% of an average company's marketing spend. Today it's 30%. So we need to understand where that other 70% is going and how we can capture that. Organization. Real quickly, I'm sure you've seen in the news that newsrooms and newspapers throughout the industry are reorganizing. There are a lot of different purposes in this reorganization. We ourselves are on the throes of one. We've brought the newsroom, integrated our online and offline newsrooms together because we're producing content that we should then be able to use irregardless of distribution platform, whether it's online, in print, to some extent. Obviously it needs to be modified, but so it brings the newsrooms together. We're also bringing our ad sales folks together so that we can begin to offer advertisers solutions instead of selling them products as we've sold in the past. And we've also reorganized by market segments. So we've created little business units with GMs who will now have P&L responsibility to go after those particular market segments. Real quickly, relevance. Quite honestly, most of this workshop is about relevance here. I won't spend a lot of time on that other than to say as you start to look at local news organizations as we are, local becomes very important as far as relevance to our audience. And if you think about local, it also means you have to begin, and this is a very difficult transition for traditional newsrooms, you've got to begin thinking about what the audience wants and stop thinking about what I can produce and how I can show it or give it to the audience. All right? And this is what relevance is about. It includes utility. What does our audience want to do? Do they want to find a restaurant? Do they want to find a movie? Do they want to know about their local government, who applied for liquor licenses? But it's all about relevance, and it's about putting yourself in the place of the audience and understanding what they want. Community. Here we're talking about enabling community. We cannot, as newspapers or news organizations, create community. We just can't do that. But what we can do is enable it. So when we find communities, for example, in San Diego, there are communities around the Chargers, the Padres, surfing, self-help. So as we find those communities, can we create launch platforms that will enable those communities to come together online, and then because we're local, hopefully also offline. And then finally, distribution. Kind of self-explanatory. I guess if Dan Gilmore was here, he'd take me to task for using distribution instead of access. But I do mean it broadly in that sense. And this is about mobile. You know, it's not just as simple as creating a website and allowing your mobile device to access it. It's about what people want to do with information when they're getting it from mobile devices. It's about TV, radio, RSS feeds, widgets. I've had in the past month, 3 of our local TV stations have called me and said, gee, you know, we really ought to get together and talk about what we can do together. And, you know, I think the reason they want to get together is because their prospects are even bleaker than what is commonly assumed to be newspapers' prospects. And we have the ability, we've got more reporters, we've got more ad sales folks, and guess what? Now we're doing video. And when the devices that we look at, the screens we use, computers, handheld devices, television sets, all simply become truly output devices, and the content comes from the cloud. Now we can compete directly with television, and we don't have to make that huge investment in equipment. So those are just some of the areas that I think will help newspapers move into the future.
Hi. So I see I'm here on a panel with Gordon of the extremely conservative Wall Street Journal and Mark of the moderately conservative San Diego Union-Tribune. I think this is just typical Northeastern Ivy League academic bias against liberals, and I'm tired of it. So I'm going to demand twice as much time. I hope you guys don't mind. Nobody mind. You just heard 2 really good, relatively tight, thought-out proposals. That's all you're going to hear for today in terms of tight, well-thought-out proposals. I'm just going to ramble for a few minutes, and I hope what I say will be relevant, because I'm not really in the business the way these guys are. I'm an ant. They're elephants. I live in the. I shouldn't take the metaphor any further than that, but. You know, I've had this obsession for the past 7 or so years with what I called the Bush administration's war against the press, and all the various ways that the Bush administration was trampling on freedom of expression, in my view, without justification. And I would write cover stories in The Nation and blog items all the time and columns everywhere and give speeches about it. And I never could really get the attention of the people who were empowered to fight it. And I sort of knew why, which was because they were all facing this digital crisis, and they didn't know how to deal with it. But I had very little sympathy for them, because, as we all know, they were still looking at 17 to 22% margins, which was more than double the Fortune 500. And I said, you know, you guys really, if you're going to have this, if you're going to be entrusted with this enormous beneficence, you have a responsibility to carry out the public side of your responsibility, which is to protect and defend the First Amendment. Then again, at the same time that these companies were enjoying these margins, and even the LA Times was still pulling in these margins at the time, the stocks of these companies were in a free fall. When Knight Ridder was put up for sale at the end of 2005, I believe the sale went through at the very beginning of 2006, there was only one bidder, McClatchy. They got it for, whatever they got it for, $5.6 billion, I think, where the CEO of McClatchy said that if you could have told him a few years earlier that the entire Knight Ridder chain was available for that price, he wouldn't have believed it. And within about 20 months, McClatchy had lost 82% of its value. And this is consistent with the way that all of newspaper companies that invest in newspapers have been treated. You're now seeing this crisis with Sun Times, where they had to sell Newsday just to raise cash to service their debt, et cetera. You know, I read the Wall Street Journal every day, and I have great respect for the reality-based part of the Wall Street Journal.
It's those news pages you don't like.
And I was trying to figure out why. What is this? Oh, I was trying to figure out why, with these incredible margins, the stock market was punishing these newspaper companies so terribly, so powerfully, and so swiftly. And until I was asked to do this New Yorker article, when I looked at all these advertising figures that you've heard about, and we were kind of micro-focused on the advertising trends, which are incredibly disturbing, but just as important are the trust numbers and the numbers with regard to young people's relationship to their newspapers. It's just a different world for young people. I teach both undergraduate and graduate journalism students, and they don't subscribe to newspapers. They don't know from a newspaper, as my Bubby or Zeta would have said. And the average age of a newspaper reader in the United States is about 56 and growing. It's, you know, if it were a television show, it would only have hemorrhoid commercials on it. And these are not people that advertisers want to reach. And of course, they're not reproducing themselves. Now, this has many implications. And where it leads for the future, because as we heard from Mark, newspapers are not all that successful at moving online, even with the reduced revenue that's available online. They're losing increasing portions of it because they're not the best vehicles to reach people. You can, as Gordon said, you can identify which parts of your advertising are wasted with other sites in a way you can't with newspapers, and so they're less risky investments. So what does one do if one is in the news business, A? And actually, to tell you the truth, I only care about the future of the news business because I care about the role that journalism and news plays in democracy. I don't really care if those newspapers that they hand out on the subway that are mostly litter at 96th Street, where I live, survive. Those things have no value whatsoever. I don't care if Entertainment Tonight or Entertainment Weekly survives. I only care insofar as they are able to support the kind of news upon which our democracy depends. And it's very hard to see in this new world where the support for that kind of journalism, that kind of very expensive journalism, that kind of journalism that doesn't readily have an obvious market from where it's going to derive. My career is kind of, I think it might be instructive to spend a minute thinking about it. Until I was about 35, my career didn't make any sense. I kept going back and forth between academia and magazine journalism, and I didn't really fit in very well in either one, and I never made a decent living. And then I got a doctorate in history, and I returned. I decided I didn't really want to be a historian after all, but I had this doctorate, and I returned to journalism, and that was when the internet was beginning, and all of a sudden, I had this talent or training, whatever it is, to reach people, to reach a small number of people in a lot of different ways. So that's what I do. I probably reach roughly the same people, but I have about 7 different jobs. I have I have 2 professorships at different schools within CUNY. I have a media column in The Nation. I write another media column for a think tank called the Center for American Progress. I write a daily weblog now for this, I guess, left-wing pressure group, you'd call it, Media Matters, which was originally begun on MSNBC in 2002. My role in the history of the Internet is that I was the first person asked by a mainstream news organization to start a weblog. So Altercation, the weblog I write, was the first. There were others before me, people more independent-minded than me, who set out on their own, like Andrew Sullivan and Josh Marshall and Mickey Kaus, but I waded in once I was getting paid for it. And I was hired back then by MSNBC when it first began, alongside such luminaries as Ann Coulter and Laura Ingraham, to be on their cable station just to mouth off. At the same time, they launched the online service where I also wrote a column. And I have a few other jobs. I've written a bunch of books. So as I imagine it, I don't really know, but as I said, I have 7 jobs, and I think I'm speaking to roughly the same people in all of the jobs. And I guess I have a talent for doing the same thing across different platforms. And some of these platforms people are willing to pay, like people subscribe to The Nation, they pay a reasonable amount, and some of them they're not. And for me, it's impossible to tell exactly. I mean, I have a pretty good idea of what's different about each one, but I don't know how I would do it any differently if I had to. My point here is that I have this little talent, which is giving my views about things I care about. I'm not good at anything else but that. I can't give you my views on things I don't care about, and I can't write about things I care about without giving you my views. There's this one little talent, which when I wrote my first book, Sound and Fury, which came out in 1992, and I coined this word, the punditocracy, there were only really about 36 people in America who could make a living this way. And now there are hundreds, perhaps thousands, or a couple thousand people who make their living giving you their views about different things. And the people who are good at this are either incredibly entertaining for their audiences, or they're giving you some important value added that demands your attention and or your money. Sorry, I'm just kidding. Drink. Now, when you think about it, that's all quality media, whatever the platform. And I mostly mean newspapers, but I also mean magazines and a very, very few television programs or radio programs. But it's mostly, think basically about your good newspapers and your really high-quality magazines. That's what they do. Some of them break news that you're not going to get elsewhere. But most of them just give you an intelligent context to understand the world around you. That's the role of media in a democracy, and that's also what everybody needs, because nobody has the time to figure out everything. The problem is that there's a tiny audience for that relative to the cost of producing it. So every single one of these major news-producing or information-producing entities is under siege right now. Sure. Is under siege right now. And nobody has any idea where the bottom is. Molly Ivins, the late, great Molly Ivins, said that the newspaper industry solution to the problems that it's facing has been to commit suicide slowly. And she's right in the sense that everybody is shedding muscle, as you said. I believe that the size of the, there's enormously more media outlets than there were 10, 15 years ago, but there's actually 25% fewer people working on news than there were. So it's like the population growing, doubling, but actually fewer people buying ads. Now, when I looked at the figures for and the trends for the New Yorker, I have to say I went into this article much more glib. I went in with a few glib ideas that I'm very grateful to the New Yorker for helping me dispense with. It's the only article I ever wrote in my life, actually, where everybody seemed to agree with it. Whenever I get read a lot, I get attacked a lot, and I haven't been attacked for this article. And I would have been if I had written what I thought when I went in, which was, I've always looked at the role of the media in democracy in the context of this debate between John Dewey and Walter Lippmann in the 1920s, where Lippmann basically said that the role of the media was to provide expertise for people, and Dewey said no, it was to provide a platform for conversation with people. That's ridiculously oversimplified, but those are the categories. And I've written a bunch of books where I took up the mantle of John Dewey, and I said, these elitist media fellows, they think they know everything. They're not giving people good information. That's why they elect lunatics like, whoever fell in the blank. And all we need is a more democratic media so that the voice of the people, which happens to agree with me on everything, could make themselves heard, and we'd be living in a much cooler country like Sweden by the time we were done. And actually, that was sort of the way I pitched this article when I was first asked to write it. That was my thought. And then I went in and I dug down deep. I don't want to pick on the Huffington Post per se, but that was the focus of that. They were John Dewey to the New York Times, Walter Lippmann in this, and the news side of the Wall Street Journal. One of the great ironies of my life is that I had to use Rupert Murdoch as the oracle of all this, which hurts me a great deal. But anyway, as I went in and I dug deep into the Huffington Post, which is up to about 12 million unique page views per month, and is about now the 8th or 9th largest news website in America, and growing at an enormous rate. I found very little value added to the news that was being produced by these dinosaur organizations, like the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Guardian and so on. And an awful lot of, and as you go down into these wonderful conversations that I had been lauding in my Deweyite ideological view, I found an awful lot of nonsense and misinformation that never got corrected, and that would be very dangerous if people acted upon it, in my view. And then, I went back to the New York Times and the Washington Post and other magazines, which I had been, newspapers which I've been enormously critical of because of how terrible they were in reporting the war. And I saw that, as terrible as they were in reporting the war, there was enormous value, A, in the investment made to go out and try and get that information, and B, in the professional mores that brought it to us, regardless of how frequently it might be in error in one direction or another. And so I completely flipped on I became much more Lippmannian than Deweyan in this respect. But just as I was flipping on this great question, it became clear to me that there just isn't the support in our society for this great enterprise anymore. The New York Times has, after its next round of cutbacks, will have about 1,200 newsroom employees. The Washington Post and the LA Times and the Wall Street Journal are all in the area of 800 to 900. I'd be surprised if ultimately those numbers are supportable within 50%. In other words, things are moving so quickly on the advertising side and the circulation side that those papers are just not going to be able to support those kinds of enterprises, and that's where our news comes from. And if we don't have that news for people to cogitate on the Huffington Post and elsewhere, then as a society we're going to be enormously vulnerable to manipulation and charlatans of the kinds that Lippmann warned about in Liberty in the News and Public Opinion back in the 20s. And for me, the only model that I can imagine, I can't see it, but I can imagine it, is a much more elite-based model, where, like The Economist, like The New Yorker, people are willing to pay very high advertising rates to reach a very rarefied audience. But that is going to leave the vast majority of people without dependable news sources. And it's going to leave them open to this kind of manipulation, and it's going to further stratify our society by virtue of their information sources. And that's a kind of dystopian vision for me. So I forgive these guys in part for ignoring my demands that they focus on the threat of the Bush administration, now that happily that day is coming all by itself and will be delivered from that. But I agree with the panelists. I think everyone has said this, that it's enormously disturbing that not only is there a quote-unquote business model dependent on facing up to this problem that they so far have been unable to do, but so is our democracy. And these two things, because of the nature of the way our media developed over time from the late 1600s, are inextricably intertwined. And all aspects of our society, and I'm speaking now particularly to universities, need to take this problem much more seriously. I'll end now just one really wonderful suggestion I heard from Vartan Gregorian, who's president of the Carnegie Corporation. He said that he thought that college students should all be forced to pay for a subscription to their local newspaper. Or they could pick a newspaper. They could pick the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or anyone. It should be part of their tuition the same way that their activity fees are, something like that. We need the major institutions of our society to take this problem of media and democracy seriously. And so far they're not, because they're leaving it to the businessmen. And the businessmen, that's not the way they see their problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, this was fascinating. There must be questions. Let's throw it open. Yes.
I've got a little bit of a different perspective on this, just because I write, sort of a freelance journalist. I write tech policy or tech news, which I think is in a little bit different place because it's a somewhat narrower field, but it's almost all online. All the high profile. There's a few like Wired that are sort of a traditional magazine that becomes a website, but there's also most of the tech news world is blogs and websites and so forth, and that's been growing very fast. And I wonder if part of the answer here is that the newspaper model, where you have this monolithic, geographically oriented institution that has sports reporters and movie reviewers and news and so forth, is just not the right model for the internet. And a lot of these functions, rather than being segregated by geography and by large monolithic institutions, that the future will be smaller, more focused organizations like a technology news website or a sports blog that collectively provide as much content as these newspapers, but aren't organized the way you folks. And obviously for the newspapers, this is sort of a grim prospect because it's not clear how you make that transition, but whether the long-term answer is that news is organized in a different way.
I think that's almost certainly going to be part of the future, and there is, when we talk about journalism, we tend to think about broad media like newspapers and magazines. There are, I think, many more journalists employed in more specialist areas like technology coverage. And in the business and financial world, there are, dozens, maybe hundreds of segments reflecting the fact that people's jobs are unbelievably specialized these days. Technology world, there are, as you say, sites serving down to, the person who's in charge of network servers has got a different news flow from somebody who's in charge of communications, from somebody who's in charge of purchasing servers. I mean, those are very different domains. And there are news franchises. They're not the New York Times, but there are news franchises that focus on those very specific markets. So the upside is, I think there will be sources of information, especially in the business world, which can justify the expense of them and whose audience is very attractive to advertisers. But it will lead to the kind of world that Eric fears, which is not just that there isn't necessarily a shared source of basic information from which left-wingers can argue with right-wingers, which is, for a lot of us, a very healthy situation. It will do that. It will also mean, I think, that information continues to be very, very valuable to people, but in increasingly specialized, narrow niches where the gap between what some people know and what other people know just grows. And I don't think we know, to me, that is not the most efficient system. A more efficient system is for information to flow very freely and for there to be more and more transparency and openness. I think we may see a time where the only way to justify news investment is to segregate the people who get the news by price.
You can go ahead.
Thanks. To me, what you're describing are communities. You're describing communities of interest, I think. And we believe on a local level that communities are very important in our future, both communities of interest and geographic communities. In our case, I think that we would be fools to try to play in a particular community of interest that's very broad, very nationally based or globally based, maybe some of the tech communities that you're talking about. On the other hand, if there are those communities that are locally based, again, maybe it's surfing, maybe it's, in San Diego's case, the biotech industry. It's very concentrated in San Diego. If we have a local view of that, then I think that becomes important and can work for us. I also think that one of the things people are very, very interested in are those things that are happening in their community. And now I'm talking about sort of hyper-local community. This poses its own set of challenges. How do you get that information? It's very difficult to get in terms of professionally produced because you have to get people out for it. But so when you look at a local news organization like that, I think it becomes this intersection of communities of interest, geographic communities, and that kind of provides what potentially where we can succeed.
I have one problem, and one very big problem, and one concern with that world. My very big problem is when you think about stories like the 7,500-word story the New York Times did 2 weeks ago on Pentagon flaks through the media, or their enormous story of last year on domestic spying, or even to take it away from the realm of the politically contentious, these wonderful past 2 days stories they've done about Saudi dating rituals. There's no money in those stories. Those stories are incredibly expensive to produce, and there's no profit. There's no profit model. There's no business model in the world that's going to produce those stories. You need to produce the living stories and the computer tech stories on your computer section to fund that kind of thing. And if we destroy these enterprises, then we're not going to get that kind of information anymore, and it's going to free a lot of people to do a lot of things that they wouldn't do if they had to worry about being reported on. That's one of the most important functions of journalism, and we're going to lose that function. My concern. A lot of people would be more worried about this than I am, but because I sort of agree with something Paul Starr said earlier, that the model, the 19th century and early 20th century model of newspapers that are engaged in their political side is actually a healthy one in many ways. It's a model that you see across Europe, but if you have all these little communities, you don't have a single shared community. You don't have what the scholar Benedict Anderson called an imagined community. If you look at the front page of your newspaper, the only thing those stories have in common is that there's hundreds of thousands or 1 million people reading them with you at the same time. And that creates a consciousness of citizenship. And you're going to lose that as you break down this community further and further. Now, I can see some value in that, but I have concerns about it too. And you shouldn't kid yourself that it's the same world, because we're not really geographically based communities anymore. We are these communities of interest, much more so, and the society will have much larger fissures with much less understanding if we go further and further in that direction.
Yes.
Earlier panelists talked about events and engagement I would imagine San Diego Union-Tribune does too, to sort of engage the community. Do you see that as a potential profit center for newspapers? Or I'd be interested in Dowd's experience and how that's created a maybe culture of celebrity around the journalists that are there.
Right. Yes, I think it's a very interesting world where I think to the surprise of a lot of people, in-person events has been a booming part of the business for a lot of companies. My own theory is that the more time we spend kind of atomized in front of our desktop or on our BlackBerry, doing very narrow kinds of work, the more need there is to actually meet other people, carbon-based life form to carbon-based life form. And that does turn out to be, at least so far, to have margins that are much more attractive than traditional publishing. In the case of the journal, I think the first of those is a conference called D, which is organized by Walt Mossberg and Kara Swisher, two of the journal's reporters, where Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, everybody shows up because they're asked to go. And the format is live journalism, very aggressive interviewing of CEOs. So good sport for the audience. And that is another form of journalism, and it will help to keep the boat from leaking altogether. I think the question is how many different areas can a brand be extended? And a business brand is much easier. It's easier for me to understand how a business brand can do that than a local metro brand. But I think there's possibilities for both, and certainly for the magazine and cruise ship business.
Yeah, just briefly, in our case in San Diego, the events that we have or had were largely around the classifieds, help wanted. So you can imagine where that's headed. But sort of to the previous answer, as we think about communities, I think there is potential there to sort of feel our way around possible events. How big a role that can play, I don't know, but it is a direction that we're looking at, and would love to find some potential there.
I don't. In the world I live in, it's not that big a deal. I mean, there's these two guys named the Bittners. They're brothers. And they own this company where they brand cruises for different organizations. It's not just magazines, but also think tanks. And it's basically a sort of celebrity get-together for the people. And the Nation sent me on the National Review cruise about 12 years ago. And I wrote a piece I'm very proud of called Heart of Whiteness. We went to Alaska. It's not online. But I didn't realize at the time that I was a spy for the business side. Victor Navasky never does anything without having an ulterior motive. And so when I came back, they said, we can do this too. And they hired the same two brothers who now work for the Nation. And there have been about a dozen of these cruises. And they can raise anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000 for the magazine without costing the people who are paying for them anything else, because it's just a matter of buying them in bulk. And you invite your quote-unquote celebrity. So when I went on the National Review cruise, they had Milton Friedman and William F. Buckley and Robert Novak, and believe it or not. And the Nation, we give them like George McGovern, Molly Ivins when she was alive, Calvin Trillin, and it's a fun, easy thing to do, and it's good in terms of creating a connection with people, and they renew their subscriptions. But it's even at the Nation, it's not a significant amount of money. I would point out, though, that one big difference is that on the National Review cruise, they make people pay for their own wine, and at the Nation, we buy it for them, even though we're the left and they're the right.
But for the Nation, it's by the carton.
Yeah,
Donna.
The discussion has been about the cost of production and how those costs have been lowered by the internet. And very little discussion about the cost of consuming the news online, which has been rising, it seems to me, because the cost of buying a computer is considerably more than buying a newspaper. And I wonder whether this doesn't just move the entire discussion over to a different segment of society. And I'm not disputing the advantages of lowering the cost of production and creating communities of interest. But what about economic communities that don't have the equal access? Does the panel like to address, the digital divide?
Well, that's not a newspaper, that's not a media problem, that's a societal problem. I mean, society is going digital. It's moving towards computers. And the digital divide, which I haven't studied in a while, but it's much more, I think, to be a geographic problem now than a class or an economic problem. I mean, you can get a decent computer for $300 or $400, which is less than it costs to subscribe to the New York Times. So I mean, really poor people are disadvantaged in a lot of ways, but people who don't have access to a computer, I think, are pretty rare now. It's mostly people who are uncomfortable with computers. Something like, I think, just about 75% of people consider themselves to be online in America now. Does that sound right?
But in an old newsroom, if you wanted to, get more coverage of the underprivileged society, you could diversify your newsroom. What do you do in the online news environment about facilitating that kind of input?
I think the reality is when you're in and I hate to be the one to have to say this here, but when you're in a business that's fighting for its survival, you're not in a charitable mode in that sense. And the kinds of conversations that occur in newspapers when somebody raises the idea of a new kind of product to reach a new market segment, it's always, can we sell that market segment? And if that segment is large enough or can be sold, it can happen. But if it can't, it's just not going to be. You're right. I mean, you've pointed out a problem, but I guess to Eric's point, it's a societal problem, not sort of a business issue.
Yeah, Paul.
So I noticed recently that several small or medium market newspapers have come under the control of nonprofit foundations, usually started by their founders and founding families, which at least has the economic advantage that if they haven't had revenues, they can plow it back into the business. Is that something which is likely to spread, or is that just
I think there are a number like that, and it does imply families, usually families, that are willing to be very uneconomic by, instead of selling what still is some value in an asset, transferring it for a charitable purpose, maybe with some tax break, but it's a big donation. So I don't know how much of it we'll see. But we have seen some of it, and I think that structure can protect those franchises at least for some time. I myself would be much more confident if news organizations could create sustainable business models than having to rely on some other status. But I think you are right. There are an increasing number of them, and they do seem so far to be doing pretty well.
Let me just break in to follow up on this question, because I feel the zeitgeist of the journal behind this answer about it being in some way more reassuring if the behavior we want can also be made profitable and sustained by the market. And I wonder if I could sort of ask sort of each of you, and sort of as you chew on these things, one of the distinctions which is not always clear to me is to what extent are people dissatisfied with the news that is as it is now, the industry as it is now, the news that's provided now. So Eric, you've made obviously this very clear in your work about shortcomings of the existing infrastructure, but sometimes it seems like most of the fear is forward-looking. Like a lot of the things are concerns that we worry will arise. Like in the future we won't have something like the New York Times. And it's always struck me as sort of weird because there are all these people going around saying, I really value the New York Times, but in the future I feel like no one's going to provide it. Or the data that I look at tells me that no one is going to provide this thing I dearly want. And it seems to me that if enough people dearly want it, that it likely will be provided. And I wonder about whether there's just sort of some pessimism, not about the ability of this market structure or this business structure to survive, but rather about the ability of the market to figure out whatever the new one is, even if we don't know what it is.
Maybe I'll go first because I probably have the least deep comments on that, given my panelists. But, in some ways, those kind of complaints remind me of, the person who's out with a petition in front of Walmart trying to stop more Walmarts from coming in, and then at the end of her shift says, gee, I just got to pick up a few things, and runs in, right, and buys them. I mean, if the audience really values this, read it. I mean, who? I'm going to make a statement and qualify it. Eric will probably shoot me, but
I don't believe in guns.
Who? Who are we to decide what people should read and what's important to them? All right. What we're doing is saying this is important to me, therefore it should be important to all of you. Now, having said that, I also think that this notion that people are uninterested in the news is a fallacy. I think that people are uninterested in the way we have so far figured out how to present it. People, kids these days, kids really are informed. They know what's going on in the world. I have a daughter in college, and we were having a discussion about some current event one time. And I said, well, how do you know about that? She really had no idea how she knew about it. And I sort of prodded her, and she went from dig, which is really unusual since she's a female classics major, but she was there, she went here, she went there, bounced around, and she finally read an article about it. She didn't know if it came from the New York Times, the San Diego Union-Tribune. She had no idea. She knew that it was a news organization. She had a feel for how trustworthy it was, but she got there. So it's this combination of how we present it and how we distribute it. And I just really think that it's not that people aren't interested, it's that we need to figure out how to present it to them. So,
let me just take one slice of your question, David. One reason I'm ultimately optimistic is I do think that for a time there is demand from at least people of a certain age for traditional media. They haven't been asked necessarily to pay it yet, though we will be asked to pay, and probably a lot of us will. And in the 10 years left before the demographics completely catch up with traditional media, that's a long time to figure out how to monetize brands, to use the business term, for to monetize the content. And even if we can't quite see how it's going to be done, if you believe fundamentally that people need and value trustworthy, independent news created by people who are doing their best to do it in a straightforward way with integrity, then the question is, can people figure out the model for it? And since most news companies are only now exiting the denial phase of this difficult challenge, there is some reason for optimism that people, having left the denial phase and engaging with the problem, will experiment in enough ways to find ways to support what now looks like an endangered art form.
Maybe this is a question of temperament, but I'm deeply pessimistic on this issue. Seems to me the only way to be optimistic on this issue is to, same way one can be optimistic, well, maybe global warming will turn out all right, which I know is the editorial position of some newspapers. But if you say, the argument that people often make is that in 1896, if you extrapolated out from the future, New York City would be covered in horse shit by now. But it's not, because the car was invented, and there's not that many horses anymore. So who knows what the future brings. But if you look at what we do know now, we know that young people are not buying newspapers, and there's a study I could cite. I can't remember the author's name, but the Shorenstein Center published a study last year by a very good scholar who's written 2 books. One is called The Black Image and the White Mind, and one is called Democracy Without Citizens. Maybe somebody knows who I'm talking about.
Maybe someone can Google this?
Robert Entman, yeah. Which specifically looked at how deep young people's knowledge was from all these various citizens, and it was really depressing. And so they sort of have some idea about things, but it's bad. It's bad. In other words, it's a Pollyannish view to say they're getting their information from the Daily Show. They're getting very little information from the Daily Show, and it's nothing like what people would assume they know or feel they need to know. So in addition to which, so you have this problem with young people, and you also have this problem with trust. 3 times as many people believe that 9/11 was an inside job as believe that their media is telling them the truth. 5 times as many people believe in UFOs as believe that their media is telling the truth. Now, maybe that's one of those situations where they say the media is lying, but they happen to believe particular media that happens to be the media they consume, which is the same way people talk about Congress, but they like their congressman. There's some of that, no doubt. But when you add all these trends together, the advertising trends, the lack of trust trends, the fact that young people don't feel any need, they don't feel any connection to what we understand to be the news, I just don't see how, I don't see where this magic bullet's going to come from. And I certainly don't see where it's going to come from given the way that Wall Street is treating these companies.
Brian?
So why isn't George Soros just by the New York Times? I mean, Charles Darwin wasn't a tenured academic. He was a guy with a private income who just went out on a boat.
I have been at so many meetings with George Soros where people have said, will you please buy a newspaper, damn it? And it wasn't to save the media, it was to save liberalism. Why does Warren Buffett owns a couple of really bad newspapers? Why doesn't Warren Buffett invest in good newspapers? I used to think that if I had all the money in the world, that's the first thing I would do with it. It'd be really fun, you know, to be a newspaper owner and to have everybody suck it up to me and stuff. But the fact is that the business has lost the prestige it once had. If you see these wonderful old movies like His Gal Friday or Deadline USA, that was a different world. And in part because so many people are involved in so many different things, it's not the attractive proposition it was anymore.
But
and,
it's imaginable.
Yeah, I can imagine all the people living in a world of peace. Perhaps. Maybe I'm a dreamer.
I think karaoke is not part of the panel.
I mean, my answer is that I feel that it's lost its prestige. If we could build back its prestige, that would be great.
Shirley?
I was sort of continuing on that. Would it be just kind of say, like, okay, the newspaper as a profitable entity is going to be kind of a dying business? So would it be just too idealistic to say maybe the National Endowment for the Arts, NPR, and PRI are going to save us, that we're going to have an emergence of our own U.S. BBC or Radio France International or something where there's more investment in sort of a different kind of news which the market is not just going to supply anymore?
But do you want a government-controlled press? I mean, that's what you'd have, right?
Well, BBC's not government controlled. It's a more sophisticated question.
Well, but I'm thinking of NPR. I mean, look at the battles over NPR, right? And that's not even completely.
It's not a perfect answer. Yeah, but we don't have any perfect answer. So, I mean, I think it's worth discussing.
If you're looking at, like, you want a certain quality of news, and the market is just not going to give it to you, and it's getting killed off in the future, is this, like, one hope?
Well, my short answer would be foundations and universities have to play a much bigger role. And because I just don't think in this country, government's not going to do it. I mean, I wouldn't mind it if they did, but I can't see it happening.
Yes, in the back.
Along the same topic, I mean, I think there are a lot of wealthy people, patrons, that would be willing, if they thought it was unbiased news, to say, I'll fund a reporter going to so-and-so place for 6 months or a year doing a story, but it has to be totally both sides, not one-sided. And I think a lot of people would actually get a lot of patrons, just like the university would, that paying for such things.
I think a general issue we do not yet know the answer to in this country is whether it's government or involvement or donations from particular people or foundations or universities or lobbying groups or whoever it may be, whether that would accelerate the decline in trust that people have in news brands. My own view is that if there's government involvement in a news brand, its trust will disappear. There may be other categories where that hurdle can be overcome, but I myself, maybe I'm too old-fashioned, but I'm a bit skeptical.
Can you imagine government support for journalism without support for a particular brand? People have proposed that. There was an article in the Columbia Journalism Review that proposed that. I thought it was an idea worth exploring.
I just think, in a world of really bad choices, the worst choice is government involvement.
I didn't mean government.
I understand. I understand. And I should mention some former colleagues of mine are engaged in an effort called ProPublica, which is a privately funded, very large investigative journalism nonprofit. So I think their aim is to have several dozen investigative journalists funded by philanthropists, much as you're describing, where the goal is for the articles that those people produce to be placed in traditional media. And it will raise some of these issues, and we'll see how it goes.
I see that Kevin, who works for The Guardian, a real newspaper, possibly the only other one in the room, or one of the few, wishes to weigh in.
Well, I had a question, and Eric Zuckerman, which for Society said something last week on the media at NPR. He said news seems to have not a supply problem but a demand problem. So right now, a lot of what everybody seems to be saying is not only there is actually a demand problem, but the product is not selling. Young people aren't interested. What, if anything, can be done to solve the demand problem as much as the supply problem?
Yeah. And let me just quickly address this, and maybe this is another reason I'm somewhat optimistic. I think especially, metro newspapers that have been geographically based are really at the beginning of rethinking what they should be, and to me the UK model is quite informative. The UK, almost all of the broadsheets are national. They're not defined by geography. They each have their own tenor, sometimes a political point of view, something that differentiates them. They have moved much faster, and The Guardian is maybe the best at this. They have moved much faster in understanding that people are getting their news and information from many different sources, from many different channels, 24 hours a day, and have crafted their print versions accordingly. And I think in the U.S. we're really just starting that trend. So I agree, actually, that at least part of the problem is a demand problem, certainly among young people who cannot understand why somebody would pick up a printed version of news that they already know. And I think that's a fundamental issue.
This book I mentioned before, which came out in the early 90s, Democracy Without Citizens, was very useful to me. It presented this problem as a catch-22, which is that people don't know what really high-quality news is, can't demand it because they don't know what it is, and yet you can't force them to get it, so they won't know what it is, so they can't demand it, et cetera, et cetera. I think everyone would live a richer life and would think that they had made the right decision if they, spent a half an hour a day with The Guardian and an hour a week with The Economist, and then they would understand the world from a left and a right perspective. I think those are two of the best publications available in the English language for doing so. And yet, how in the world could you imagine convincing most busy Americans who are, worried about so many things, et cetera, to do that? People live in time poverty. So the demand problem has always been there because newspapers and other forms of media have never been as good as we would like them to be. The New York Review of Books has never, had a mass circulation. But the fact is that the problem has evolved into a crisis. And so that problem, as Robert Entenmann posed it, I think when that book came out in the 1986 or so, is now another one of those luxuries that we don't have time to worry about anymore because we don't know how the damn thing is going to survive, period. And you know, The Guardian, I think, maybe you should talk for a few minutes, because The Guardian is an exception to a lot of the rules we're talking about here. It's got a unique ownership structure, and it has managed to extend its reach in lots of interesting ways that maybe the Wall Street Journal has in its own way, but it's got a model that no other newspaper in America has been able to replicate, and it seems to work. Is that right?
Yeah, so we're, I think, about 10 minutes away from an adjournment which will allow the conversation to continue over wine and cheese in the back. But before we do that, I personally would love to hear, Kevin, if you want to tell us just the basic story of The Guardian's. Let me just interject. If this isn't being recorded, maybe we can recruit you up to the podium.
The Guardian is actually, similarly to the St. Petersburg Times, trust supported. So in the late 1920s, early 30s, I believe, one of the longtime editors of The Guardian formed a trust, and it was actually out of some self-interest. At the time, the fortune that he had would have been basically wiped out in death taxes had he not found some way to shelter it. So he created a trust that supports The Guardian. And the entire structure of the Guardian Media Group is actually to maintain the financial and editorial independence of The Guardian. So there are commercial parts of the Guardian Media Group, but their whole role is to pay for us. And that has allowed us to do a lot of interesting things. And The Guardian was the first newspaper to go online in the UK. I think maybe the Telegraph beat us by a couple of months, but launched a website. And now, along with the Times of London, more than half of The Guardian's online traffic comes from outside the UK. About 40%-ish of that traffic comes from North America. And so we are rapidly expanding online. Our CEO, our basic strategy is to become the liberal voice, the world's leading liberal voice. And as people have kind of alluded to, the newspaper model in Europe is a bit more similar to the 19th century newspaper model, in that if you see someone with the Times or the Telegraph or the Guardian on the tube, that will say something about their political leanings. But that's really our strategy, and we are sort of we do have some shelter from some of these economic winds that are buffeting everyone, including the BBC right now. The BBC is going through a pretty painful time because of reductions in the license fee. The license fee being, I pay £130, about $260, for the privilege of receiving a live broadcast television signal, whether that's on my television, which isn't actually a television, it's a USB stick that plugs into my computer, or on my computer over the internet. So they're a bit under challenge as well. But those are just a couple of other business models, and I'll be more than happy to chat with people and conversation, let this great panel continue.
I just want to say one word about this demand issue. I can't think of another product where the product managers would sit around and think about how we can increase demand for that product without also addressing what the product is, improvements to the product, how it should work. I think that the hand-wringing, and I don't mean to downplay it because it is important, but the hand-wringing over this demand issue starts to get in the way of trying to solve the problem. And the problem is, how do we get this information out in a way that people want to consume it? And those of us who are kind of on the business end here and trying to make some money and keep the institution alive to some extent, don't always have the luxury of thinking about demand. How can we increase demand? I mean, we need to create products that people want to use and read. And that, which is different than saying, let's abandon, our democratic mission and watchdog mission. I'm not saying that. I'm saying let's create products that people want to read while doing that.
J.D.?
Yeah, I'd like to ask Mark if you could respond to Gordon's idea that metro newspapers need to reinvent themselves online. I'm looking at Sign On to San Diego right now, and the top two stories are about Congress doing a pay raise for wow, we're like 25 years old, like the guys are so fast.
Right, right.
So I'm wondering whether or not, first of all, on the philosophical level, can you tell us a little bit about what your thinking is as far as what new approach that a metro paper can take, if any, online, and whether or not, you go in a national direction, like for instance,
Yeah.
or a local direction, like you're doing with, I guess, the backyard. I don't know how that is.
Yeah.
working.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for pulling up that. We've had a lot of internal discussions about it is, and to some extent, our site is a bit depressing at this point. And it's sort of a timely question because we're actually in the midst of a strategic business review of where we're headed and also ultimately a redesign of that site. And we're in a somewhat of a unique position in the say that's different than the LA Times, right? The LA Times covers a region that's very large. There's Orange County Register in there, and there's other competitors like that within the region they want to cover. For us, we really have no other. Well, I really hate to say this because it's never true about anything, but there's not a competitor like us. Okay, so as we start to look online, we begin to think about becoming a news and information portal, the source for San Diego and San Diego County. And that means, again, thinking about the audience and what the audience wants. It means thinking a little bit like Google in the sense that any content on the web, and in our case, any content that deals with San Diego is our content, right? We can link to that. We can highlight that. We can do that. And we have to get over this, we won't link to a competitor. We have a competitor in the northern part of the county called North County Times. And I've used this example several times with our editor, and I've said, well, if the North County Times scoops us, we'll link to them, right? We'll put them on the homepage and link to them. Well, you can imagine the sort of consternation that causes. But that is the direction I think we need to head into. Now, we'll obviously continue to produce the kind of information that we can, that we think is important, do the watchdog journalism, but it's on a local level. So, we'll use the AP feeds, New York Times News Service, and that'll bring us in the national news because what we've seen is people do when they go to, whether it's their homepage or a news page, they want to know enough, right, so that they can have the water cooler conversation and sound intelligent at that point. But locally is where they start to dig in. Now, of course, it's very fragmented at that point. But if you can become this portal and start to segment your audiences in a local sense, so that's generally kind of where we're headed there. Does that answer your question?
I worked for Microsoft back in '96 when there was a San Diego sidewalk.
Yeah.
And to this day, it's 12 years later, and I'm frustrated when I go to a local community and I can't get basic information.
Sure.
What's happening tonight?
It's utility information. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a problem.
Just real quick on that point, the discussion you just heard about linking to competitors, that discussion can be replicated in about 12 or 15 different areas whereby the traditional habits of a newspaper are not consistent with what you need to succeed in a digital world. And yet all the people making the decisions are people who have been raised in the first world, and it's just a real big problem.
All right, I don't know what the future of news is, but I know that the future of this conversation involves progress toward those refreshments in the back. So I hope you'll join me in thanking our panelists.